Welcome to this explainer detailing the public history of our modern world. To really wrap our heads around the incredibly complex, frankly gritty reality of New York City in the year 2026, we've got to look backward. We need to dig into the miraculous divergence that kicked this whole thing off back in 2001. We're going to trace the timeline right from that era of global warfare all the way to the heavily regulated, superpowered society we're living in today. So think about it. What actually happens to a world when a god basically falls from the sky? It's a retrospective question, sure, but it really sets the perfect tone for understanding our history. Before the corporate proxy wars and the UN security forces we deal with today, we have to revisit that awe-inspiring, inciting incident. Everything we know right now stems from one single, completely impossible morning. Okay, let's look at the timeline. It was September 11, 2001. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 was on a direct collision course with the North Tower of the World Trade Center. But literally right before impact, a figure just exploded into existence, catching a massive Boeing 767 in midair and safely landing it right on the Hudson River. Unbelievable, right? And it didn't stop there. Minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., this exact same mysterious figure intercepted United Airlines Flight 175. By 9:37 a.m., he grabbed Flight 77 near the Pentagon, and finally, at 10:23 a.m., he stopped Flight 93 near the Capitol. 4 hijacks planes, safely landed, the terrorist on board, completely apprehended. Because of this, the towers never fell. An absolute global tragedy was entirely averted in just a matter of hours. This right here is the profound historical divergence of our timeline. Thousands of lives were saved, and the entire world just collectively held its breath, trying to comprehend what had just intervened on our behalf. The being who stepped forward called himself Aegis, and based on the sensory details on record from that day, he looked exactly like a comic book come to life. He wore a pristine white uniform with a flowing red cape, completely emblazoned with a golden shield bearing the head of the Gorgon Medusa. This was our first undeniable proof that superhumans were on Earth. I mean, the guy demonstrated superhuman strength, utter invulnerability, unaided flight, and honestly, countless other unexplained powers. He wasn't just a man. He was a literal living myth walking among us. And Aegis didn't just stop with New York either. Between 2001 and 2003, he single-handedly reshaped the globe. Within weeks, he completely dismantled al-Qaeda and the Taliban. He toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, and he forced Kim Jong-il straight to the negotiation table. By 2003, get this, he had ended every major war on Earth. Dictators just disappeared overnight. Terrorist organizations dissolved. Aegis officially declared the age of conflict over. He became the living, breathing symbol of a totally new world order. But his arrival had a secondary, completely unforeseen consequence. Scientists formally call it quantum resonance, though I'm sure you know it by its media name, the Aegis effect. Basically, Aegis's sheer presence acted as a massive catalyst. Suddenly, starting right in New York and spreading outward like wildfire, millions of people worldwide began manifesting superpowers of their own. Some were incredibly minor, sure, while others were absolutely terrifying. Just like that, we had entered the Super Age. So how did the world react? Well, this brings us to what historians call the Golden Age reaction. Global powers basically scrambled to adapt to this new reality, and they did it in 2 very different ways. Governments rushed to create newly minted superhuman affairs departments, getting desperate to somehow manage the phenomenon. Corporations, on the other hand, they bypassed management entirely and began aggressively recruiting and weaponizing these powered individuals. It was an era of pure awe, but also a rapid, chaotic land grab for power. Section 2010, the bureaucracy and the Aegis Accords. Obviously, the unregulated freedom of the Golden Age couldn't last. The result was the United Nations Aegis Accords, and these mandates were strict. Mandatory superhuman registration became global law overnight. If you lived in a high-risk zone, tracking implants were suddenly required. Power usage was limited strictly to those with national or corporate licenses, and crucially, any unregistered supers, the folks often called rogues, were now legally classified as terrorists. The law brought a definitive, heavy hammer down on the entire powered population. Section 2011 to 2026, the Enforced Peace. That legislation paved the way for our current era. Now, while the world is technically devoid of major nation-state wars, the peace we have is incredibly complex, and that's largely due to Aegis himself. He rarely appears in public anymore, intervening only for massive global-scale threats. Instead, he stays in the Aegis Spire. That's floors 90 to 110 of the North Tower, right where he first saved the world. It's been heavily reinforced with these massive external crystalline additions, and he just watches from up there, like a silent, godlike deterrent. But beneath that glittering spire, the reality of New York City in 2026 is starkly divided. On the surface, yeah, it's the shining capital of the Super Age. You've got pilgrim encampments literally worshipping Aegis, and these massive holographic bright shields projecting between the towers at night. But in the shadows, there is a really gritty underbelly. We're talking about corporate supers fighting shadow proxy wars right in the streets, deadly black market augment drugs that grant temporary powers, and highly dangerous rogue gangs operating just under the radar. Because Aegis stays up in his spire, an entire ecosystem of factions has risen up to either police or totally exploit the gaps he leaves behind. The modern power dynamics are essentially a powder keg. You have the official UN superhuman security force, though they're mostly bogged down by bureaucracy. You have private corporate police forces who are loyal only to their shareholders. And pushing back against them are the black market AUG drug syndicates, plus those unregistered rogue vigilantes who are really just trying to survive in a world where being unregistered makes you an enemy of the state. Which honestly leads us to a very different perspective on our world's so-called savior. Down in the underground, among the folks who actually remember what true freedom felt like before a god landed between the two towers, well, they don't exactly see a savior. Their street-level moniker for him is chillingly simple: the tyrant in white. It really shows exactly how this enforced godlike policing is viewed by the people living out there in the gritty margins of our society. So I want to leave you with this to chew on. Look at the world of 2026. Is the glittering perfection of the Aegis Spire and the absolute end of global warfare truly worth the cost of that gritty, heavily regulated, and often brutal reality operating in its shadows? It's a wildly complex world we've built since that day in 2001, and understanding these factions is absolutely your key to navigating it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep your eyes open out there.